this is your story, regardless of who you are. That this is the story that tells you about your own family, your own family's story. I am somebody who loves the Smithsonian maybe more than just about anything else. As soon as they offered me this position to become the 14th secretary, the first thing I did is look up all 13 and try to understand what were the challenges they faced, what were the opportunities before them. The Smithsonian is a reservoir of possibility that challenges a country to be better, to live up to the ideals of a country that is innovative, diverse, and fair. In some ways, my whole career had been training to become Secretary of the Smithsonian. I came to Air and Space in 1978. I left to teach at university. In 1989, I came back to the Museum of American History. From 2005 to 2 weeks ago, I was at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I had a staff of 2, no idea where the building would be, no collections, no money. For 11 years, I had to tell people, believe that this museum will happen. The Smithsonian is the great strength of hope. In the 21st century, cultural institutions have to have a nimbleness that they haven't had before. My hope is to find that tension between utilizing technology and building on the assets of the Smithsonian so that we can reach new audiences. The public shapes you as much as you shape the public. I want to make sure that the work we do really allows the Smithsonian to put its shoulder to the wheel so that we're contributing to that sort of educational awakening of America. Now is the time for all of us to bring our resources, our creativity, and our support, because the Smithsonian has a role, and that role is to help this country live up to its stated ideals. So the success of the Smithsonian, the success of my tenure, is really being able to make sure people understand that when they contribute to the Smithsonian, you're contributing to making a country better.
Hello, my name is Bruce Harrell, and it is my distinct pleasure as the mayor of this great city of Seattle to welcome you all, and particularly to welcome the United States Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Mr. Lonnie Bunch, virtually to Seattle, the nation's first African American Secretary of the Smithsonian. Now, Seattle is a special place, and tonight is a special time as we reflect upon the past, the present, and the future of Black history. So many major feats in Black history occurred right here in Seattle. We salute the Northwest African American Museum for hosting this forum. NAAM and African American museums like NAAM have the distinct task of interpreting the past, presenting it in a way that is engaging, particularly for young people, and casting our eyes toward the future so that we can use the past to shape a stronger future. Even during times of a pandemic like this, NAAM seeks to engage the community with Black art, storytelling, culture, and crucial conversations like the one being held tonight with Secretary Lonnie Bunch and the University of Washington's own Dr. Quintard Taylor, who I'm proud to call my friend and my fraternity brother. The Northwest African American Museum plays a crucial role in influencing young people from toddlers to college-age students and beyond to discover the richness in our Black past, the early civil rights movement to the modern Black Lives Matter movement, and more. Tonight's program is about shaping a stronger future by studying our resilient past. Thank you, Secretary Bunch, for being with all of us here in Seattle tonight.
There are some individuals who propel us toward our purpose. For me, Lonnie Bunch is one of those individuals. I watched him from afar as he served in several curatorial and leadership capacities throughout his career. I was in awe of this brilliant, stately, kind-hearted scholar and leader. When I became actively involved in the Association of African American Museums through my work with Juanita Moore, President and CEO of the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, I came into the closer orbit of Secretary Bunch. Seeing him in the audience of a conference talk I gave at the 2014 NAAM conference gave me a reason to be both nervous and to shine. After the session concluded, Secretary Bunch came up to me and heartily affirmed my words and my work. He sees, listens, responds to, and supports those in the Black Museums field. His presence today as NAAM's 2022 Black History Month keynote speaker demonstrates this truth. Secretary Bunch generously shares his wisdom that others may rise. To have Lonnie Bunch as a mentor and model is a treasure that I cherish. It was an honor for me to be asked to write the review of his book entitled A Fool's Errand, Creating the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the Age of Bush, Obama, and Trump, in which Secretary Bunch chronicles being the founding director of the 350,000 square foot museum on the National Mall. Secretary Bunch always humbly says about himself that he is just a historian trying to make a difference. We're delighted today to host the incomparable Secretary Lonnie Bunch and be in conversation with this remarkable historian who is making a profound difference during these fiercely trying times of both challenge and opportunity. The Northwest African American Museum is on the rise, and we continue to glean from Secretary Bunch this February and far into our future.
Hello everyone, my name is Leland Adams. I am a graduating senior at the University of Washington, Tacoma, majoring in business administration with a data analytics minor. As a young student, I didn't know the power of Black museums until I became a youth curator in the Northwest African American Museum's Youth Curator Program. Working with a handful of talented peers and well-respected artists from the Northwest community like Al Doggett, I learned how to tell my stories in my authentic voice and produce multimedia displays that honored Black lives. I'm proud to be a former NAAM youth curator, and I'm blessed to have met some incredible community members who spoke creativity and life into me as a youth. Being a young Black man born and raised in the Central District of Seattle, my history is connected to the museums just as much as the iconic figures who hang from the walls today. NAAM is a place that harbors Black culture, knowledge, and movement for our people in Seattle. People like Dr. Quintard Taylor and Secretary Lonnie Bunch inspire me, and therefore it is my honor to introduce Dr. Quintard Taylor as today's moderator. He is Professor Emeritus of American History at the University of Washington. He is a specialist in African American history in the American West. Dr. Taylor is also the author of several books, including The Forging of Black Community, Seattle Central District from 1870 through the Civil Rights Era. Dr. Taylor is also the founder of blackpast.org, an online website resource center for African American history. It is the world's most comprehensive digital place for information on Black history and features contributions from more than 700 scholars from 6 continents. Dr. Taylor has won numerous awards and has served as president of the Western History Association. Let's welcome historian Dr. Quintard Taylor.
Hello. Wow. Leland, thank you for that introduction. That was magnificent. And I certainly appreciate all that's come before in terms of the remarks about Director Bunch and myself. I have the distinct honor, though, to formally introduce Director Lonnie Bunch. Lonnie G. Bunch III, is the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and the first African American to hold that post. As such, he oversees 21 separate museums, 21 libraries, the National Zoo, and numerous research and educational centers in the Washington, D.C. area and across the nation. I can say without fear of contradiction that Mr. Bunch is the most important figure in the universe of American museums. Now, notice that I didn't say African American museums, but American museums. Mr. Bunch holds that position at the Smithsonian, at least in part, because he almost single-handedly built the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. When he began in that position in July of 2005, he had one staff member, no collections, no funding, and no official site for the museum. I believe that more than even a young senator from Illinois named Barack Obama, Mr. Bunch epitomized the idea of hope when he organized the national campaign to build the most important museum dedicated to sharing the story of Black America in the history of this nation. Lonnie Bunch crisscrossed first the halls of Congress and then the nation, gathering a collection of donors and especially persuading those donors to share the hope that this museum would be world class. So to use his words, a place that would make America better, quote unquote. When the museum opened in September of 2016, it had a staff of 205, an annual budget of $51 million, but most importantly, a collection of over 40,000 objects, many of them donated not by the traditional donors, that is, wealthy collectors, but by what I call ordinary people from their basements, from their garages, from their attics, items that might have been thrown away in a different era, but that now tell the story of a nation within a nation, some 40 million African Americans. I want to personally commend the Northwest African American History Museum for persuading one of the most important figures in this nation's cultural history to come to us tonight to speak about the importance of museums in preserving the history and heritage of African Americans. I personally want to thank you, the museum, for allowing me to lead this conversation with my hero and inspiration, Lonnie Bunch III.
You are much too kind. I am overwhelmed by the wonderful words. But like I said, like you, I'm a historian that just tries to use what we know as a tool to make a country better. And I am so honored to be here with the Northwest African American Museum, a place I admire. I've visited often. And so thank you for letting me be part of a conversation, but especially thank you for letting me hang out with you.
Well, thank you. We are going to hang out. We're going to take the next 30 minutes or so to have that conversation. And I want to begin the conversation with some stats, with some statistics from blackpast.org, if you guys don't mind. First, let's talk about the museums all across the country. Black museums exist in 40 states and the District of Columbia. The largest number by state is the state of Texas with 12. By the way, I happen to be in Texas as we are speaking today. The oldest museum is the Dusable Museum of African American History in Chicago. It was founded by Margaret Taylor Burroughs on February 16th, 1961, which means it is 61 years old as of yesterday. There's a total number of Black museums across the U.S., and that number is 177. So we're talking about a host of institutions that represent the broad breadth and depth of this country, and particularly of African America. And so with that in mind, Director Bunch, I want to raise some questions with you and to begin this conversation. First of all, what are Black museums in the United States in the business of doing? Why do they exist?
You know, in some ways, I really think Black museums have a very specific role. Their challenge is to define reality and still give hope. In many ways, I've been struck by the person that mentored you and I both, John Hope Franklin. He used to always say to me that it's crucial for a museum to tell the unvarnished truth, to make sure people cry when they look at and understand the pain of slavery or segregation, but also find joy in the resiliency that's in a community. So for me, what Black museums really do is they challenge us to remember, because by remembering, we create a useful and usable past that is a wonderful reservoir that the public can dip into to understand themselves, to understand their history. But as you said, to be a place that is as much about today and tomorrow as it is about yesterday. In my mind, African American museums are central to the success of a nation because, in some ways, when they're at their best, they can't be community centers, but they could be at the center of their community. And
Wow.
that, to me, is what's so powerful about Black museums.
Wow, that actually leads me directly into the second question. How have Black museums informed and influenced how we understand the totality of American history? You've sort of hinted at it in your previous answer, but how do we know America better as a result of these Black museums?
I mean, in some ways, what I think you and I have tried to do with history is to centralize it, to help people understand that these stories are a two-sided coin. On the one hand, they're rich, powerful stories about a community, from a community. But on the other hand, that this community has shaped in profound ways everybody, shaped in profound ways the nation. Almost any moment where America moved towards greater fairness and freedom and citizenship, African Americans were involved. So in some ways, the challenge is to make sure people recognize that whether you are African American, Asian American, white American, this is your story too. And that in many ways, what I've been struck by is that these museums, every time I go to a museum, I actually learn something new because I see a story through a different lens. And that different lens gives me inspiration and hope. And so I think ultimately what I feel that African American museums do is they force all Americans to understand the totality of themselves, not just to see African Americans as an ancillary story, but in many ways as the quintessential American story.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you for saying that, because I think one of the old statements, it's almost become a cliche, that African American history is American history. And now I think most people accept that, but you and I are old enough to remember a time when we had to make that argument over and over and over again, not just to white America or to non-Black America, but often to African Americans themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, I think in many ways, I was always struck that when I was in graduate school, even the professor said, "Do you really want to do African American history? You know, you're such a good American historian." I said, "That's what I'm doing, good American history." And so I think you're absolutely right that the challenge has been to help people be comfortable with sharing their history, learn by delving deeply into that history, and being brave by confronting that history in all of its dark corners and all of its dark past. Because by doing that, you then, I believe very strongly, you then understand yourself. And that's why I would argue it is so crucial for African American museums, African American historians, to make sure we're in the battle, to make sure that the education that our next generations receive is really an education that is ripe with diversity, ripe with history, rather than ripe with myths.
You know, this is an amazing statement from you, and it's so profound because we're at a moment in the history of our nation when there's a debate about whether we should even talk about African American history, that people feel that somehow or another it's uncomfortable to tell that story. And certainly there have been those who have argued this before, but now there's a national political movement to strike these kinds of stories from the American educational system. I know we won't get into a discussion about critical race theory, or we shouldn't get into that discussion, but in a way, that's what's going on. Critical race theory, at least if I can editorialize, critical race theory is a response, a reaction to the fact that you and people like you have been so successful in telling this story.
Yeah, I think
you changed the narrative.
I think that's right. I think that's the challenge. You know, I refuse to let anybody define what I'm doing, right? So I don't even fight the fight on critical race theory. What I fight the fight on is to say that we are a country that is better when we understand the fullness of our history. And are you telling me that a country like America is afraid of the history of its own self?
Right.
Um,
Right.
and that, in essence, in some ways, this is really the challenge globally. As I spend time
Mhm.
around the world, it really is a fight for people to both first understand the challenge of the outsider, the diversity in their communities, but then to centralize that. So it's not the ancillary story of, a few Africans who came to France, but rather
Mhm.
these are people that profoundly shaped French culture. So I think it's a challenge here, but it's really a global challenge to say, learn thyself. And when you
Mm.
learn thyself, you
Mhm.
heal thyself.
Wow. No, I think you're exactly right. The thing that I'm struck by, and I haven't traveled abroad as extensively as you have, but the thing that I'm struck by, Director Bunch, is the fact that people around the world see African American history and the Black freedom struggle as inspiring to them. They take our lessons, and in some instances take our lessons of struggle more seriously than we do. And when I say we do, I mean certainly more seriously than a lot of white or non-Black America, but also sadly more seriously than a lot of Black people do. I spent some time in Russia, and I was surprised at how well versed people were there on African American
Right.
history. And in some ways, it was almost embarrassing because they knew more about African American history and they celebrated the struggle of African Americans more than we do here, certainly in the United States. So
I think
it's kind of the
I think
paradox.
I think you put your finger on something really important. What I was struck by as we built the African American Museum once we opened is that the African American Museum in Washington has the largest percentage of foreign visitors to the Smithsonian,
Wow.
because that's it's just what you said, that for
Mm-hmm.
many people, their first introduction to America was through African American culture,
Mm-hmm.
American history, and that as people wrestle with liberation,
Mm-hmm.
wrestle with defining what a nation should be and defining fairness, they look to us. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you worry that Americans, Black Americans, sometimes don't value how rich their history is, how
Right.
important their history is, not just to us, but to the world.
Right. Very, very much so. This next question comes essentially from the mouths of so many students that I taught for so many years. Uh, we're enthusiastic supporters of African American history. We sort of marinate in that history, but a lot of students, including a lot of Black students, will ask, "So what? Why should we have Black history? How will Black history improve our lives and our communities?" And I try to answer that, but I'd love to hear how you would respond to that question.
I probably answer it the same way you do. On the one hand, it is this sense that when you want to understand the possibilities of change, when you want to understand what it takes to help a nation be fair, where better to look than in the African American community? When you want to understand the resiliency of a nation, when you want to understand how a nation can be made better, where better to look than the African American history?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it really is this sense that, look, there's many ways you could frame this. One is looking at this history really does give you hope. It provides inspiration. It helps you understand that the struggle for fairness is not a linear march to progress. So when people say, oh my God, what's happening now? I say, it's part of that pendulum. But what you do is by digging into the past, you suddenly say to yourself, dog, if Fred Douglass can do this, if Sojourner Truth can do it, or if somebody whose name you don't know. I always kept with me, I have a picture that I keep with me. It's a formerly enslaved woman, probably taken about 1875. And she is very small, but her knuckles are swollen from work. Her clothes are tattered. She's carrying a hoe that is taller than her and a heavy basket, but her head is up and she's striving. For me, that's the image of Black history.
Wow.
You carry the
Wow.
burden, but your head is up and you're striving.
Let me follow up on that. we're in a moment of challenge. I guess Black people have always been in a moment of challenge. I mean, we as historians understand that, but we're in a moment of challenge right now. What can Black history do? What can African American history do to champion change at this moment? We're in a period of repressive politics. We're in a period of conservatism. There seems to be a lot of pushback against African American progress. What role does Black history play in sort of turning that around?
I mean, first of all, what it does is it tells us that the struggle continues, right? That there is you're never at the promised land of possibility. Where you are at way stations where you're getting closer. And so it should sort of inspire us to recognize that as long as there's an America, we're going to have to fight for fairness. But that fairness is also helping America be made better. I think the other thing that I'm struck by is that whenever I need inspiration, I look into the past. Whenever, and whether it is your own family, mine were sharecroppers and said that's not life good enough for them, and they changed the trajectory of an entire family. So for me, it's being able to sort of use that for inspiration. But also, as I said earlier, I use it for hope, because every time I despair, I think of those who went before and say, if they despaired, if they gave up, where would I be? And I took a lesson from John Lewis, who was instrumental in creating the museum and was a great supporter and friend of mine. And I remember sitting down with him and saying, okay, let me be honest. I'm watching you get, destroyed and hurt on, in the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I'm watching you get arrested time and time again. Don't you ever despair? Don't you ever worry that maybe what you did, was it worth it? And he stopped me and said, the most important thing to remember is that despair is defeat. As long as you look back at our culture, and you can be upset, you can be pained, you can be worried, but you should never be defeated. Wow. And so that notion of using history, again, as this reservoir that you dip into, this reservoir of possibility, is really what excites me about it. And I guess the other thing is, as a historian, the kind of critical thinking that comes with thinking about the past, trying to understand it. And I would argue maybe the greatest contribution that history can make is that history teaches us to embrace ambiguity. Far too often, Americans look for simple answers to complex questions. The road to victory is linear.
Right.
But history teaches us it's about nuance, it's about subtlety, it's about complexity, it's about ambiguity. Think about the contribution you make as a historian. If people could understand that there aren't simple answers, that there aren't simple victories, that it's a long process, what change you could make to an American mindset. To me, that notion of helping people embrace ambiguity, that's worth it by itself, learning history.
Wow. That's brilliant. That is nothing short of brilliant. I want to turn the conversation in a slightly different direction. Black museums are under a challenge now, financial challenge. I mean, there's always a financial challenge. Even the National Museum has its financial issues and challenges. What is the responsibility of the Black community to support these institutions? I mean, should the Black community play a special role in making sure that these institutions survive? And if so, what should that role be?
I grew up in a little town in New Jersey that had like 2 gas stations, and the gas stations had the sign that said, "Cash makes no enemies, let's be friends." So in a way, the challenge for these museums is to build a cadre of friendship, right? Of people who will support it. I believe very strongly that the African-American community really will support institutions that, 1, do good work, that 2, that recognize that they're at the center of their community, and that they really say, how do we provide strong educational possibilities so that future generations will understand the past and be made better by it. And I think that, so part of it is demonstrating your worth. Like the Civil War black soldiers used to say, proving your worth. So in essence, it is really setting out a mindset that says, what do we do that matters? How do we enrich education? How do we give people hope? How do we give people tools to live their lives? So I think it's being of value. Two, I think it's really articulating clearly that these are places that need your support. Often African American museums sort of feel the sense of, well, we've built it, they'll come. Instead of recognizing you've got to work at it, you've got to develop the same kind of strategies to reach out to a variety of communities. When I was building the African American Museum, now even though it's a national museum, there was this great sense that nobody black would support it, right? That you couldn't raise a lot of money from the black community. And I thought that was unbelievably wrong. Here is a community that supports its churches, that supports HBCUs. So maybe the key was to demonstrate why this was important. And so what I did was I approached this on three levels. On one level, I said, let me get black folks around the country to join as founding members, to say, you get a chance for $25 or $50 or $100, you get a chance to do something most people believe can't happen, which is building a national museum on the mall. And literally, everybody, well, most people at the Smithsonian tell me that was a dumb idea. You don't, you're going to be free when you're open, but you're not even open yet. But I knew that, I guess, when I was doing research in LA years ago, I was interviewing this older woman she was probably my age, but she seemed so old in those days. And she said, you can have the photograph on the wall, but you can't have what was stuck in the photograph. So I pulled the photograph down, and what was stuck in the photograph was her father's membership from the NAACP from 1913. Wow. And so I never forgot how important that card was. So that card sort of really opened up so many doors. But then I realized there are black people of means who really haven't been tapped, who really didn't recognize how central these institutions are. And so what I love is the fact that of the people that I was able to get to give $1 million to the museum, 70% were African Americans. Now
that's amazing.
I thought maybe it was going to be 20%, 70%. And then, to be honest, the thing that stunned me the most about telling me how a community can sort of shift to a museum is when black churches gave money. Alfred Street Baptist Church opened their doors and said, here's $1 million to support a museum. Now, I got to tell you, if you told me a church was going to give money, I was just never happened. But, so what I'm arguing is the community is responsible, but the community, both the black community and the broader community, is responsible as long as you, one, demonstrate your worth, and then two, recognize you got to work at it. You got to think about, who are the people? How do you build victories? I mean, I'm a big believer in little victories every day take us to the promised land. So I would try to really look at who can I get to give some money that by doing that will open other doors. So I think that I would argue there is a real responsibility, but it's a mutual responsibility. It's a responsibility of the community to provide support, and it's a responsibility of the museums every day to demonstrate their worth, to prove that what they do is make a community, a city, a nation better.
Wow. That gives me a lot of inspiration, especially for us who are working at Black Past, because, we have financial challenges all the time as well. That leads, though, to another question, and you sort of touched on this, but I want you to explore it more fully. We understand, given what you said, we understand why Black people should support these museums. Why should non-Black people support these museums?
I thought a lot about that when I came back to build a museum. I said, am I building a museum just for Black folks? Am I building a museum that shapes us all? And so what I argued, and I still argue very strongly, that the great strength of the museum was that it was definitely a community-driven, deeply personal. humanized exhibit museum,
Mm-hmm.
but that I framed it that let us recognize that this is a museum that is a lens into what it means to be an American. Now, it's a lens through African American culture. So explicitly, when we would sit down and I would work with curators, because there's nothing worse than letting a historian who shouldn't be putting his fingers in, put his fingers in. But I sat down and I would say, so tell me how this resonates for a Black community. But now tell me how other people can see this is their story. And then the other thing that was so essential to me was when I built the museum, the goal was to humanize history, to really say that, yes, we're talking about slavery, we're talking about migration. What we're really talking about is William Trammell getting his freedom papers in 1850. Or we're really trying to get a story of, Chuck Berry writing music in the 1950s. So the goal was to humanize it, and that also made people care. One of the things I'm proudest of about the African American Museum is that 45% of the people that go to that museum aren't Black. And even more importantly to me, 33% of the people who go to the museum, at least until 2 years ago, 33% said they had never been to a museum as an adult.
That's amazing.
It was important.
That's amazing. That's amazing. We have time for just one more question, at least for me, and then I want to open it up to the audience. The Smithsonian Museum, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, is kind of the superstructure. It sort of stands, I won't say stands above and apart from, but certainly stands at the apex of the structure of museums in American society, African American museums in American society. How do you define your relationship to other Black museums, the other 177 Black museums in 40 states in the District of Columbia, stretched all across the country?
Well, I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and I realized that the museum needed to be a beacon that would draw people to Washington, but then would push them back to the Northwest African American Museum, to say, go to the California African American Museum to see how this story is through a local lens, or go to the African American Museum in Dallas. So the key was, first of all, to be intentional about that kind of collaboration and push people back. And then I actually created a unit. I said, you create educational units, curatorial units, but I created a unit whose job it was just to collaborate with museums around the country, whether it's to offer training, to do collaborative exhibitions, to learn from. So for me, it was being intentional, that if the museum in Washington prospers and nobody else does, then we fail. But what I love is after the museum's opening, suddenly there was more interest in history, in African American history, and many museums told me they had increased visitation because people either heard about, went to, was sparked by the interest of the African American Museum. So my notion is that this museum has to be part of a universe of amazing institutions, large and small, who tell a story that is often undervalued and often forgotten. And their job is to make sure that they are a clarion call to remember.
Wow. Director Bunch, we have just a few more minutes left, and I would be remiss if I didn't open it up to questions from others. So far, I haven't seen any questions yet. I think they're coming up right now. The first question is, what was the most challenging aspect of being a founding director?
I think it was, in many ways, did I have enough stamina and confidence? Because I worried a lot about, could I do this? I'm not John Hope Franklin, I'm not these great. And so I worried about that. And so what I realized is the biggest challenge was to craft a vision that could be inclusive, that could get people excited. But I would say, if you said to me, what's the biggest challenge? The biggest challenge was to be bold and not be afraid. So what happened is, you're building on the National Mall. I didn't know if I was good enough to pull it off, but the key was that at least every day I would work with staff and say, let's be bold, let's be brave. And I'd go home at night, go, oh my God, what am I doing? But the key was, let's say, let us not make little plans. The
Wow.
culture is worthy of much more.
Fortune favors the brave. I mean, that's an old expression, but it certainly holds in your case. A second question, and I'm my eyes are bad, so I have to strain to read this. So excuse me for leaning forward. In our digital age, and mindful of factors of COVID, are Black museums the best way to share Black history? How can this be done online? How can Black history be shared online?
What you want, I mean, you know, the work that you've been doing, Quintard, is crucially important to that. And what I think you want to try to do is cultural institutions need to find the right tension between tradition and innovation. Mm-hmm. When I was once known as the guy that built the African American Museum. Over the last 2 years, I've been known as the guy that closed the Smithsonian twice, right? So what I realized was that I needed to pivot digitally. And so what I want is for all of us in these cultural institutions to recognize that there are thousands of people that we'll reach every year, but there are millions that we can reach online.
Absolutely.
And so what you want to do is think about what is an online presence versus a concrete presence. It's not simply, taking what you do in the museum and put it online. It really is recognizing that much like writing a book or much like doing an exhibition, there are certain things that medium does well. So what does online work do well? So I'm a firm believer in that. When I would be if I was in museums in LA or Chicago or Seattle, I'd be talking to the technical community to say, how do you help me make sure that I'm conveying these stories that are worthy of everybody, even if they can't come to the museum?
Well, you and I are going to talk after this program, because we certainly hope that we can collaborate with you. Black Pass is getting a lot of traffic for Black History Month. We've gotten over 750,000 visitors since February 1st, and we're on our way to becoming to getting the first million visits month in the history of the website. So, yeah, there are ways to reach that broader audience. There's no question about it. There's one other question, and again, I apologize for leaning forward, but let me see if I can pull the platform closer. What do museums need to do to draw young people and yet keep other people engaged?
I think there are several things. First of all, this notion of humanizing history is something that I found young people really engaged in, that they're not swept over by the wave of slavery, but they see it in a personal way. The other thing I think is that, one of the things I'm proudest of when I was president of Chicago Historical Society was I created this initiative called Teen Chicago. And that in essence, it got teenagers, 9th and 10th graders, to first do oral histories. I had Studs Terkel, the great oral historian, teach them how to do oral history. And then I asked them to go around the city and interview people about what was it like to be a teenager in the 1940s or the 1970s. And they then did a major exhibition. And what I loved is the one that won the award as the best exhibition of the year from the American Association of Museums. Not that I'm competitive, but on the other hand, what was key was out of those 30 kids, 29 went to college, 29 graduated college. Half of that went on to graduate school. And so in a way, part of it is thinking interesting, out of the box ways to engage young students who, in some ways, what we found we were building a museum, young kids were interested in seeing the actual as well, because they had seen the virtual their whole lives, but they had never seen the real. So really, that's what I mean, trying to find that integration between the real and the technology.
Okay. We've got time for one more question. I'm going to share it with you. Secretary Bunch, what does the museum being the center of the community look like to you?
You know what it looks like? It looks like, think about a place you want to go when you were a teenager on a Saturday afternoon, and that you recognize that it's a place you can take dates, but more importantly, it's a place where you can find yourself. And I think that for me, what I want is, when I was at the California African American Museum, the goal was to say, you can't understand yourself. You don't understand Black Los Angeles. And Black
Mhm.
Los Angeles cannot be uncovered unless we look at it through the lens of, the story of individuals. So I think that one, it means that. Two, it means thinking about non-traditional ways. One of the things I love is the Anacostia Community Museum, part of the Smithsonian, one of the
Mhm.
earliest museums. What they did is they recognized they were in a food desert. So they worked with this group called sort of, Refrigerate the Community. And basically, we put in their parking lot 2 refrigerators full of
Mm.
food where the community can come. And so over the last, I don't know, 6, 8 months, they've given away 500 meals to people who needed them.
Interesting.
So,
Wow.
so in essence, what I'm saying is, let's think about in traditional ways, be the
Mhm.
best traditional museum you can be, and let's
Mhm.
think about other ways that you serve the community. Because what you want more than anything else is people to say that you matter, and you matter because you help, you provide understanding, you define reality, and you give hope.
Wow. Wow. This is wonderful. I wish we could continue this conversation, but unfortunately, there are time limits, and so we're going to stop it at this point. Director Bunch, I mean, this is you're, I don't want this to be a mutual admiration society because you've said kind things about me, but what you've done is just remarkable. It's amazing. No one else, I think, could have done this anywhere in the country, anywhere else in the country, and so I applaud you. But with that, I am going to turn it over to another amazing person,
Mhm.
Director DeBarter Layden of the African American Museum here in Seattle. Thank you, Lonnie. You're amazing. I'm even more impressed now than I have been before, and I was always impressed.
You're so kind. Thank you.
Bunch and Dr. Taylor. We here in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, we would like to thank you for sharing your words of truth, encouragement, empowerment. You have given us direction and inspiration. We salute and celebrate you, and we look forward to continuing to be on this road with you as we use Black history to heal our nation. Thank you, my mentor, my model, Secretary Bunch. Thank you. And Dr. Quintard Taylor, you are remarkable in every way. Thank you for moderating this invigorating conversation. There really is no better way to spend a Black History Month evening than with two luminary historians who are making a difference on the world stage. We would also like to thank our Seattle Mayor, Bruce Harrell, for being with us tonight. And we thank our former youth curator of the Northwest African American Museum, Leland Adams, for sharing opening remarks. Thank you all for tuning in and being with us for this Black History Month keynote program. We hope that you have enjoyed and that you've been inspired to move, to act, and to live out the words that Secretary Bunch shared with us tonight. At the Northwest African American Museum, Black history is our mission 365 days a year. Join us in this movement of using Black history, art, and culture to uplift, inspire, unify, and create an equitable future. It starts now. Thank you.